Good morning, everyone. Our first speaker is Professor Andy Lamey. Professor Lamey is an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, and author of Duty and the Beast: Should We Eat Meat in the Name of Animal Rights? Today, he will be speaking about what is meat.
All right, thanks very much. Just going to open my slides. Okay, so I am hoping that people can now see a slide that says what is meat at the top. My thanks to Sophia and Rupert and the other organizers for organizing this. I'm excited to be here. And my thanks to everyone for coming. So I think we have until 12:35 today. So I'm going to try to talk for about 45 minutes so that we have at least 45 minutes for a Q&A. And I'm really looking forward to that. So my talk, I'm going to try to do three things. So I'm going to talk about the rise of cultured meat. As we'll see, this is both, I think, a philosophical question, what is meat, but also a very timely one for reasons that I hope will become clear. And so after giving some background, I'm going to try to launch an argument to the effect that cultured meat, or as it's also sometimes called, in vitro meat, lab-grown meat, cellular meat, all of these labels mean the same thing, meat that's grown in a lab. It is meat. It is meat just as much as traditional meat that's sourced in the carcass of an animal. And so what I guess, what is perhaps contentious in what I'm saying is, for something to be meat, it need not be sourced in the carcass of an animal. Okay, that seems at odds with our traditional thinking about the nature of meat, but that's what I'm going to argue today. And I will try to conclude by considering some objections to my view. All right, so this topic is one that recently got a fairly large burst of media attention. About a week before Christmas in 2020, a restaurant in Singapore, the restaurant has numbers in its name, I think it's called 1880. They got a lot of media attention after they became the first restaurant to commercially serve so-called cultured chicken bites. So if you look at the woman in the lower right-hand corner here, she's holding up her bill from a meal she bought at that restaurant. I think on the first day they served them, showing she was one of the first people to buy this food product, which is shown in the upper right-hand corner of my slide. So if you were to bite into that item without knowing anything about it, it would taste exactly like chicken. It would have the same texture as chicken. If you were to do a molecular analysis of that product, it would have the same internal structure and substance as chicken. What makes it distinctive is not anything to do with the way it tastes or what it's made up of when you actually bite into it. What makes it distinctive is the fact that it originated in a lab rather than in the body of a still living animal. So the company that made that company is actually, the company that made that chicken bite is actually a San Francisco company, Eat Just. And so they served the first restaurant offering in Singapore because Singapore was one of the first jurisdictions to permit this kind of food product. As we'll see in a moment, there's a big debate going on now in the United States. Some forces are trying to resist the spread of this food product. Okay, so that's actually not though what got me interested in cultured meat. What got me interested in this product was something that happened about 7 years ago. So 7 years ago, this guy, Mark Post, he's American, but he runs a lab at a university in the Netherlands. He had a press conference in the United Kingdom where he ate what was called at the time the world's first in vitro hamburger. So back then, people tended to use the words in vitro more, but it seems like now the word cultured meat is catching on more. But as I say, those are just two different ways of referring to the same thing. So that burger, like the chicken bites in Singapore, was identical to a traditional hamburger, but for the fact that it was not originally part of the body of a living cow. So these products are made by taking some cells from a cow or a chicken. So I think in the chicken case, they took some cells from a chicken's feather and then they take it to a lab and they put it, they have it there in their lab, and then they bathe it in a growth serum. And that growth serum combines with the cells to kind of grow and adapt, and you get the flesh of the animal without the animal itself. Okay. So that first burger that Post made, at the time, he said that it cost $325,000 just to get there because it was the first one. And then in 2015, he said the cost had dropped under $12. I didn't know what to make of that. But if the Singapore case is any example, it seems like we are well on the road now to these products becoming, they already are commercially available in Singapore. Okay. So there's issues around the process by which these products are made. In particular, there's issues around the use of the growth hormone, which I'm going to return to later on. But the points that I want to make do not otherwise really hinge on details of production. It's more, as I say, this kind of question of, is it meat or not? Okay. So Post in his lab, they soon pivoted to a commercial venture where they were racing to bring some version of cultured beef to market. They are not alone in that, as I've already mentioned, another company that seems to have beat them to the punch, at least when it comes to chicken. But there's lots of other companies now racing to try to develop some version of cultured meat on a really widespread scale. So Memphis Meat gets a certain amount of attention. They're doing meatballs and chicken and duck. Finless Foods, they're doing fish. There are other companies trying to do lab-grown versions of eggs and milk and whatnot. So there's a lot of interest in these products, and one reason is there's a lot of people who think, if these really catch on and you get it on the ground floor as an investor or whatnot, there's a lot of money that could be made, and that may well be true. But there are other reasons beyond pure avarice why people are taking a lot of interest in the possibility of replacing traditional animal-sourced meat with the cultured alternative. So here are some reasons other than just sheer avarice as to why this is getting a lot of attention right now. Now, I think the first reason will not be news to many people here. I'm sure it's not news for you to learn that one of the drivers, not the central driver, but one of them of human-caused climate change is the role of animals in agriculture. So here's an influential report released by the Food and Agriculture Organization, United Nations organization, who put forward in 2013 what seems like the first very reliable statistics on the degree to which animal agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. On a global scale, it seems that 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions are a result of livestock, in particular of cattle. So if you think of cows burping out methane, they increase the amount of methane, a greenhouse gas, in the atmosphere that would otherwise not be present if the cattle were not there. Okay, so I don't think this is shocking. So that's one reason why some people are very interested in these kinds of alternative products, because, well, if there's no cow burping out methane, then the greenhouse gas will not be a result of continuing to eat meat so long as it takes this form. This is sort of a side point, but there's been some attempts to come up with alternative solutions to that methane issue. So sometimes I teach at UC San Diego. Some scientists at UC Davis are trying to develop a scheme where if you feed seaweed, a certain kind of seaweed to cows, that seems to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions. So I just mention this because it seems like these kinds of schemes also getting a fair amount of media attention right now. But there's a lot of unknowns around them, and people have said that the likelihood of being able to scale up cultured meat is more probable than being able to scale up this kind of solution. So here's a quote from a scientist in this phys.org piece who said, if a seaweed feed supplement is a viable option to make a difference globally, then the scale of production would have to be immense. But with nearly 1.5 billion head of cattle in the world, harvesting enough wild seaweed to add to their feed would be impossible. Even to provide it as a supplement to most of the United States' 94 million cattle is unrealistic. Okay, so that's one reason why people have said there's not enough seaweed in the world. But it turns out that, as I say, so some people think it's going to be easier to scale. Now we don't know yet, right? But that's one reason why it gets a lot of interest. Even leaving aside all the climate change issues, though, there are other environmental problems that come with the way that we manage livestock right now. So you've probably read stories about the rate at which the Amazonian rainforest is having to contend with deforestation. The introduction of cattle farms on a large scale in Brazil is one reason for that. Not the only one, but one of them. There's issues around soil erosion, around pesticides having lethal effects on non-targeted animals. That book where some of these stats are from, if you look at the cover of that book, that's a satellite photograph by an artist who did a series of these satellite photos of large feedlot operations. So as you may know, a feedlot is where cattle are sent for the final few months of their life, where they try to fatten them up in as efficient a way as possible. And so when you concentrate animals at that level of intensity, you get a lot of runoff, which is leading to the discoloration that you see in that image. So that discoloration would be the result of urine, manure, unconsumed food, mixing with the massive amounts of antibiotics that are pumped into the animals to try to make them efficient growers into the largest size they can possibly be, right? So even if the climate stuff is addressed, we still face all this. Turning from cattle to pigs. Here are some waste lagoons outside a hog farm in, I believe it's North Carolina. So you see the big purple lagoons there. That's the result of huge amounts of urine and manure running off from the sheds where the hogs are confined, mixed with chemicals that try to kind of treat them. There can be health issues for people who live downwind of those kinds of operations. And then, of course, there are many harms that occur to animals in the production of meat. I won't be so gruesome as to list all of them, but when you think about chicken sheds on the same scale as those feedlots or those hog farms, where you have in some cases millions of birds crammed together in these large, dark, cavernous sheds, it's an unnatural arrangement for the birds to be in such close confinement with one another. And as a result of that arrangement, a common outcome is that the birds begin to pack one another with great frequency, which of course reduces their value. So the industry standard response, or one of them at least, is to engage in a process known as debeaking, where you cut off their beaks. Beak is a very sensitive part of the animal, so as you can imagine, it's very painful, and it's perfectly legal because, as you may also know, animal welfare laws do not apply to agricultural operations in the United States. I could go on a lot more about that, but I think all of this is kind of well known. And then finally, this book from 20 years ago, Fast Food Nation, it had a description of what it's like to be a human being who works in a slaughterhouse that I think is still accurate. And it said that it's the most dangerous job in America. Working with knives, try to kill at times unruly animals, can be very repetitive. It can put a lot of strain on your back and other joints. And I think the sign that it's kind of dangerous, unattractive work, one point in evidence in favor of that characterization is the fact that it's commonly a job, not always, but it's commonly a job that not just immigrants, but immigrants who arrive without citizenship papers and so don't have much legal recourse if something goes wrong on the job. It's the kind of job that they tend to take up in disproportionate numbers. So the last thing I'll say about this is even before the quarantine that we're experiencing now due to COVID-19, even before then, there was already widespread concern about zoonotic diseases, which are, of course, diseases that jump from one species to another. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. But even before COVID, there were SARS and other ones. When you put animals in these kind of environments that, as I say, are very much at odds with their natural behaviors, they have become breeding grounds for more than one type of disease that has begun in agricultural facilities and then jumped the species barrier to us. So for all of those reasons, a lot of people are taking a strong interest in what's going to happen with this cultured meat stuff, because I don't want to say there could never be any kind of negative or downside, but a lot of the big, most obvious negative environmental problems would seem to be drastically reduced, as would the harms to human beings and certainly to animals who would no longer be killed in the extraordinary numbers that we kill them now. Okay, so that's all going on in the background. Okay, so, but as I mentioned before, not everybody is welcoming of these kinds of the rise of cultured meat. So as I speak, there's a really big debate going on in the United States right now, and it's going on mostly in state legislatures and courthouses across the country. So what's happened really since 2017 is there's been a wave of so-called labeling bills that have been brought forward at the state level. You know, I think Mississippi was the first one, but there's been lots. They haven't, so about 25 states have seen bills of this kind be drafted. They have not all become laws yet, among other reasons. There's a lot of resistance to them, as I'll explain in a moment. But what they have in common is that they are attempts to regulate how food products are presented to us in the grocery store. And they very much include attempts to regulate how cultured meat is presented to us. In particular, many of these labeling bills would seek to prohibit the makers of these products from calling them meat or using words like burger or, you know, even chicken bites that they used in Singapore. Now, these labeling laws are not just a reaction to the possibility of cultured meat, which, as I say, has not even been sold in grocery stores yet in the United States. They tend to also be concerned with the rise of plant-based alternative food products. So in the upper right hand there, I don't know if you've ever had an Impossible Burger, but the Impossible Burger is one of these new, they're sometimes called veggie burgers 2.0. So they're not cultured meats. They're made from plants, but the degree to which they mimic meat in the traditional sense is much higher than your average, say, lentil or bean-based veggie burger. So they'll bleed in the plate. It's beet juice, but it looks like blood, right? So these laws, they certainly target, they absolutely target cultured meat, but not just that. A lot of them also go after milks as well. So when I go into the grocery store now, I'll see a lot of traditional dairy milk, but I'll also see a fair amount of oat milk and other non-dairy alternatives. So they're targeted as well. So here's a couple examples of these kind of labeling laws. So here's a bill that's being proposed in Texas right now. Meat means any edible portion of a livestock carcass that does not contain lab-grown, cell-cultured, insect, or plant-based food products. So that's very typical. It says both of those cannot be called meat. There's one in New York that says that milk has to be the lacteal secretion obtained from one or more healthy mammals, from cows, goats, or sheep, or water buffalo. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so now I don't want to give the impression that my interest in this topic is a result of these labeling laws. I think these labeling laws have kind of very serious problems that have been very widely pointed out, such that I don't think they really raise any kind of deep philosophical questions. Okay, I'll mention two of the many problems that people have pointed out with them. So number one is they seem fairly obviously at odds with rights that are protected under the First Amendment of the American Constitution. Is it really within the purview of the government's job to regulate what I call the stuff that I eat or sell or buy? So already a lot of these laws have been hit with First Amendment legal challenges. So I think I mentioned the first one was in Mississippi. So that got revised in the wake of a First Amendment legal challenge. And then here's a judge in Arkansas in a recent case who addresses kind of the basic underlying argument that seems to be put forward by proponents of these laws. And so the argument seems to be, oh, people could get confused. I could go into the grocery store and pick up a plant-based or a piece of cultured meat, and I would mistakenly think it really came from an animal. So this judge, something they said has been quoted in media stories now. The state appears to believe that the simple use of the word burger, ham, or sausage leaves a typical consumer confused But such a position requires the assumption that a reasonable consumer will disregard all other words found on the label. So as somebody else once said, it's like these laws, it's like they're a solution in search of a problem. It's not really clear that people are really going into the grocery store and making mistaken purchasing decisions. A lot of them, like the label you see there of the Beyond Burger, which is similar to the Impossible Burger, it really mimics a traditional hamburger much more with much greater fidelity than an old-fashioned veggie burger does. You can see it says plant-based right on the label, right? So some people have said, this doesn't really matter for my purposes, but some people have said it's because these products have sort of kind of catch on right now that the agricultural industry is worried about that. And this is an attempt to stop the amount of competition that they would otherwise have to face. Okay, so the reason I mentioned this labeling laws stuff is not because that was a source of my own personal interest. I got interested in this back when Mark Post had that news conference. But people sometimes say, oh, philosophers, your head's up in the clouds. There's nothing kind of real world at stake in what you talk about. Well, I hope it's obvious. One of the things that's going on here is a debate about how should we define meat? What is it? A lot of those laws are attempts to define legally with the power of law what meat actually is. So that's just one of several ways in which I think this conceptual question, what is meat, has some fairly obvious significance beyond the philosophy classroom, although I like to think it's also interesting on purely philosophical grounds. Okay, so that's all kind of prelude to what I want to do now, which is to try to put forward now a way of thinking about meat that would be more minimal than the way we've traditionally thought about it. And in particular, that would take out of the definition or the very concept of meat something that has long been there, which is the idea that it must necessarily come from the carcass of a once living animal. So I want to say that meat, the concept of meat, should include, it certainly wouldn't exclude meat from an animal, but it also wouldn't exclude cultured meat. So as a step towards putting forward this understanding, it's helpful to draw a distinction between the concept of meat and various conceptions of meat. So those words sound a lot the same. So let's see if we kind of unpack them. So this quotation from Michael Hardiman, who's actually my colleague down in the UCSD philosophy department, I think he puts it very well when he says, the concept of X provides the most basic possible characterization of X. A conception provides a particular way of articulating a concept. So the concept is the most minimal, bare bones way of defining something. And a conception goes further and fleshes it out, okay? So imagine I had this kind of what I hope you will agree would be a very confused understanding of justice, okay? This is kind of a gruesome example, but I hope the gruesomeness makes it vivid and therefore memorable, okay? I kill someone and then I do a painting with their blood, okay? And you come in and hopefully you would say, oh my gosh, that's horrible. That's a terrible crime, a moral wrong you've done, Professor Lamy. And I say, no, I think this is actually a very just thing that I've done. And you're like, well, how could you say that? And I say, well, look how beautiful the painting is. If it's beautiful, it must be just, right? So that's just a very odd, eccentric, unusual way of thinking about justice. It seems like I've put forward a candidate for justice that is not even close to our traditional, most minimal understanding of what justice is, okay? It's like I've confused a concept from the realm of aesthetics, beauty. I've confused an aesthetic concept for the concept of justice, right? So there's all these concepts we use in other domains. We don't like beauty from the aesthetic domain. Very few people, I think nobody would say, well, that's a way of, that can be just, right? So, or I should say more carefully, that is justice. Justice just is beauty. That seems a deep conceptual mistake, okay? So those kinds of examples, that kind of oblige us to say, well, what is justice if we had to kind of give an account of just the concept? So it seems, well, some things we might debate this, but some things seem to reoccur in many different ways of articulating the concept of justice. It's something that has application to the institutions of our society, most obviously the justice system, but not just that. So justice seems to be some kind of framework that is meant to apply to social life on some level. Also, it seems to involve some notion of ensuring that people get what they deserve or are entitled to, okay? So if we had to give some kind of bare bone definition of justice, it would be something like that. But of course, that's very minimal, and it still leaves room for disagreement on crucial points. What do people deserve, for example? Okay, so that's what separates the concept of justice from a conception. The conception tries to go deeper, really kind of spell it out. So suppose you ask me, what's my conception of justice now? And I say, yeah, I'm really all about an eye for an eye. I think that's really the heart and soul of justice. And it turns out that you have a more modern view, and you say, well, Professor Lamy, I'm more of a turn the other cheek person. Okay. Now, those conceptions, they have something in common. And it's that it shouldn't be so hard to see how they are at least candidates for a conception of justice in a way that being beautiful is not. Being beautiful seems to miss the very concept. But if you and I are debating eye for an eye versus turn the other cheek, then it seems like both of those, while they're not both going to be equally plausible, I think eye for an eye is ultimately implausible, right? But we can at least understand how somebody would think it's a conception of justice in the first place. Alternatively, maybe I'm a very hardcore libertarian, and my theory of justice when it comes to the economy is people should just be allowed to exercise their property rights. Whereas your conception of justice is some version of socialism that involves a greater role for government in the redistribution of resources. Libertarianism and socialism are both conceptions of justice. They both involve trying to spell out in greater detail what is in the more minimal concept. Okay. So hopefully the idea of the concept being more minimal and the conception being an attempt to flesh out and articulate and spell out and put meat on the bones of the concept, as it were. Hopefully that distinction is clear. Okay. So what is going on, or what I want to happen when it comes to meat, is to reconceive the concept. And I want to do so in a way that I argue is akin to previous rearticulations, rethinkings of a concept. And one way that this kind of process has happened historically is with other ideas that have some kind of material embodiment. They kind of, and that changes in some way. So imagine this example, okay? We're living in some society that historically used animals for currency. So there were some societies that did that. So I would buy stuff with, I'd like to buy this piece of land and I'll offer you 3 cows for it, okay? So the cows are like the currency. Then one day, somebody gets the bright idea of no longer using animals as currency, they start using coins. So there I am, I've never known anything other than a cow to be currency. And the scales fall from my eyes and I realize, no, I've traditionally thought that it's part of the very essence of currency that it has to be an animal. But now it turns out you can have currency without the animal. So my concept, whereas before I built into my concept of currency, it's just got to be a cow, that now drops out and I have a more minimal concept of currency. And that causes me to retroactively reclassify what I previously thought was the very concept of currency. No, that was a conception that I had. I was fleshing it out, but now with this additional element, it's got to be a cow. But it turns out that was part of my conception. In this case, I now see that's no longer necessary. You could somewhere, if you wanted to, still use cows, right? But it's not part of the very concept of what it is for something to be currency in the most minimal sense. No, it doesn't have to be an animal. Another example would be the way my own personal understanding of what a car is has changed over the course of my lifetime. So when I was growing up, when I was a kid, if you asked me, what is a car? Just tell me the concept of a car. I would have mentioned things like, well, they run on gasoline and they have a steering wheel and you drive them and they have, now we read stories about electric cars, self-driving cars. And I've had to revise my concept. And I realized, oh, no. In the most minimal sense of the term car, at the very conceptual level, it doesn't actually have to run on gasoline. That's one conception. That's one way of spelling out what a car is, but it's not essential to the very concept. So certainly gas-powered cars, they're still cars, right? But I've stripped down my concept to take out that element, to widen it to include electric and other cars. Final example, more recently, when there was a debate about the overdue legal recognition of same-sex marriage. A lot of that debate was about definitions of marriage. And some people who opposed that change, they tried to bake into the idea of marriage, oh, it has to be between one man and one woman. And then other people came along and said, no, you're putting something in the very concept of marriage that is not actually essential to the concept. That is but one conception, but there are other equally legitimate conceptions, including one between two people of the same sex or the same gender. And now some people will go further and say it doesn't even need to be two people, right? So it seems like this happens again and again historically. And I should just point out, before I leave off this distinction for the moment, the common element that is found in all these kinds of revisions that I'm presenting you with. And it's not like in each case, the idea of currency or what have you, or cars, it's not like it's just open season and we can just say, we can offer any understanding of what a car is now. That's not really what's going on. In each case, what's going on is the original concept is having one element removed, but other elements that were always there remain the same. So a car remains some kind of transportation device. A marriage remains some kind of relationship. A currency remains an economic instrument, right? But we take out that other element that we thought was essential, and we realize that is not essential to the concept itself. So I argue that the rise of cultured meat, this should be a good occasion for us to do something similar, to take out something inessential in our traditional understanding of meat. So saying that, though, requires us to kind of get clear on, well, what is our traditional understanding of meat? So I think there's three important elements that I borrowed from another philosopher named Jeff Sebo that I want to identify and say, I think this is what's traditionally been going on when we've tried to articulate the concept of meat historically. So it seems like it's had kind of three elements. So one is the idea that it had to come from the carcass of a once living animal. So there's this origin component. And certainly when you ask me, before I got interested in these issues, like what is meat, I would have pretty quickly, it wouldn't have been the only thing I mentioned, but it would have been one of the things I mentioned. Yeah, meat is something that comes from the body of an animal. It's not just origin though. There's also, I think, a second element, which is its substance. So what is it made of? So meat is made of protein and amino acids and water, kind of stuff if you did like a lab-based analysis that you would reveal what it's kind of made of in the simplest possible terms. And then the third traditional aspect, I think, really has kind of two components, but they're both aspects of meat's function. So what it does. And so it seems like one of the functions of meat, right? Meat is something that you eat. And so one of its functions is to generate a certain reaction, a certain taste, it's something that we experience, right? Whether in the mouth or in the belly. So there's the taste in the literal sense, but not just that, right? The sense of being sated after a big meal. There's this great phrase that food scientists use, the mouthfeel. So if you eat an orange or have a glass of orange juice, it'll have a similar taste, but a different mouthfeel because the texture and the solidity is different. All of that is part of the function of meat when we think of it as something that we experience by eating it, okay? But also I think its function goes beyond that, and it also contributes to, it has a nutritional function, and that can vary a lot depending on, if it's a really highly processed meat, it may not be so good, but other meats might be perfectly healthy. Okay, so three aspects of the traditional concept I want to say are a certain view of its origin, of its substance, and its function. And when you have those three in mind, you can go through a lot of discussions of meat and see how they pop up. So here's a chapter in an anthology of philosophical writings that actually includes a short chapter by the guy who invented Beyond Meat, Ethan Brown. And he's the guy who he's the guy who invented Beyond Beef. And so here's what he says: meat is actually pretty simple: amino acids, fats, carbohydrates, trace minerals, and water. So that would be like the substance in my framework, combined to give us a familiar chew, resistance, and variation. That's one of the functions, the experience. But what if we are able to take these same inputs from plants and combine them to look and feel just like animal meat? And so we contrast the traditional origin with meat from plants. That would be an origin of this alternative meat product. Okay, so these ways of breaking down the traditional concept, I think, you know, there's some evidence that that's not just me being eccentric, that is how we've traditionally thought about the concept. So what I want to say is, for something to be meat, it only needs to tick off 2 items on that list of 3. So for something to be meat, it should have meat's traditional substance and its traditional function, but it need not have its traditional origin, which is, of course, being sourced in the carcass of an animal. So I don't want to rule out, right? So certainly if you present with me traditional meat, I'm certainly not going to say, oh, is that from a cow? That's no longer meat. That's not where I'm going, right? I want to say that is an alternative conception of meat. So that's perfectly legit, right? But the reason that's a legitimate conception of meat is because it also ticks off the 2 necessary items, okay? So given that those are the only 2 real necessary elements in the very concept, we now can open the door to say, well, the stuff that comes in a lab, that's also meat. And it's equally, there's no degrees of meatness here. It has those 2 things just as much as traditional meat does. They're both meat, okay? So it's a little bit like the concept of milk, okay? So if you think about coconut milk, if you recall one of those label definitions that I showed you, it had said it could come from a cow or a water buffalo or what have you, but it seems like it would rule out coconut milk. So that's one other problem with those kind of laws. But, you know, coconut milk is a kind of milk, just as traditional cow's milk is. Similarly, cultured milk is, when I say cultured milk, cultured meat is meat just as much as traditional meat is. Okay, so that's what I want to say. Okay, so that's really it. That's my argument. Okay, now, but there are people on the earth, sadly, who don't want to agree with me. So what should we say to them? Okay, so I'm going to finish up now with some objections. So maybe you've been to France and you're familiar with their appellation d'origine contrôlée food labeling system. So if you make sparkling wine in the United States, you can't call it champagne. You have to call it champagne because it didn't originate in the Champagne region of France. So they have lots of foods like that, and not only in France, but Italy and elsewhere. So it might seem like, well, wait a minute, Professor Lamy, here's an approach to food that seems to emphasize precisely the element that you are saying, at least in the case of meat, is not important. But on the AOC approach, which is widespread throughout Europe, they emphasize precisely, or it's not the only thing they give weight to, but they do give weight to it, right? So do I now have to pick a fight with people in France and elsewhere who have a view of food that does emphasize origin? And I think I actually don't have to pick a fight with them, okay? And the reason I think that what I'm saying is actually consistent with the AOC approach is that while people in France and Italy do place emphasis on the origin of champagne or cheeses or other food products, when you ask them why, it's not just for the sake of the origin itself. It's rather, they say, where it's made has an actual influence on the kind of product that it's produced in the end. So Champagne USA, here's a little snippet from their website. Location is particularly important to wine because the grapes and wines gain specific attributes due to the soil, air, water, and so on. So in my framework, that's them saying, in the case of wines, the origin, it will impact the substance and the function. If that's true, then there's a way of justifying those labels. And it's because the origin is a proxy for something that I do acknowledge matters, which is the substance and the function. So I don't think I'm in a deep fight with them. If somebody did say, no, I think it's part of the essence of Champagne that it come from the Champagne region of France, even if that has no impact whatsoever on the actual product that goes in the bottle. So you can't taste any difference. There's no difference at the compositional, the substantive level. I would have a fight with that person. I would have to say, well, at least when it comes to meat, I'm taking a different view. But I'm not sure how popular that view is. As I say, I don't think the AOC system, which is the most prominent example of this alternative approach, I don't think it's reducible to that kind of origin for origin's sake approach. Okay, let me switch to a very different objection now. What is sometimes called, or what I've called, the intelligibility objection. Okay, so I work in the area of animal ethics, and there are some animal ethicists who say that cultured meat is actually objectionable for one of the reasons that I already touched on. So one of the items in my list trying to explain why so many people are interested in this product had to do with possibly changing the fate of animals, in particular, the number of animals that we subjected to painful agricultural practices. And some critics have said, well, it may seem like there's something positive for animals here, but really cultured meat, not just cultured meat, some critics like Rebecca Sinclair, the one I'm quoting here, say the same thing even about veggie burgers. They say, no, what these products really do, here's the quote, perpetuate a framework of intelligibility according to which animals are edible. So in other words, just to make sense of the idea of any kind of meat, including cultured meat, if you know what the English word meat means, then you know that in some sense it involves eating flesh. And so according to Sinclair and other critics, in order to make sense of cultured meat, we have to assume a framework according to which animals are there to be eaten. Now, Sinclair and other people want to say that's a bad framework, okay? Now that view is obviously controversial. Of course, meat eating is a very mainstream activity in the contemporary United States. So one possible objection somebody might have would be to say, well, look, Sinclair, your assumption that animals aren't there to be eaten, like let's fight about that. But I want to take a different approach, and I want to say, look, even if we agree with Sinclair, the animals are not there to be eaten, this argument will not go through. Okay, so how might we make this objection? How might we make this reply? And perhaps a prior question is like, why should we adopt this strategy of response? Well, there's more than one reason to explain why I'm responding to Sinclair in this way. But leaving aside the debate, between Sinclair and your average omnivore, if everybody can get behind these cultured meats, if omnivores, vegetarians, vegan, if everybody can get behind them, I just think that's going to make their arrival and their adoption more likely. But if they get coded with this really kind of this claim, if they're regarded as controversial in some quarters, I think that will kind of slow their spread. So even aside from other possible reasons, I think there's something on a pragmatic level to try to show why this argument fails in its own terms, why the it's bad for animals argument fails and can be shown to fail, even if we don't challenge the premise that it's based on. So here's a line from Sinclair. One cannot have meat without a death, and it is this death that haunts the discourse of all meat, plant or otherwise. Cultured meat, of course, being part of the otherwise there. So in the final 3 or 4 minutes of this presentation, let me take a crack at replying to this objection which gets a certain amount of attention among my fellow philosophers. So one is, okay, well, maybe it is bad in some sense, but maybe it's less bad than what happens according to Sinclair's framework when people are eating, chickens the old-fashioned way. Okay, so maybe there's kind of a lesser evil justification. And somebody who didn't eat regular meat and only ate this stuff, it seems not at all clear to me that they're actually accepting, let alone reinforcing, a framework that says animals are there to be eaten. And the reason for me saying that is they're actually literally not eating animals. They're eating cultured meat, which didn't come from an animal. Okay, but I think the deeper problem with this objection is that it just has a very conservative concept of what meat is. I've been trying to say that we should open ourselves to the possibility that cultured meat is an occasion to broaden the concept of meat such that it would not necessarily be something that must necessarily involve eating animals. And the critic that I'm responding to seems to just assume that it is. So this argument that says, well, you're assuming a framework according to which just making sense of this product presupposes the idea that animals are there to be eaten, I think that's actually not true. And the final point I'll make about this would be to draw an analogy to something that has happened historically in the realm of language. Okay, so there's all these terms that were once insults and were later adopted by the targets of the insults. So members of the Quaker religion, Tories, suffragettes. In some contexts today, LGBT people have embraced the old slur queer. These insults have been kind of reclaimed, and they've had their meaning kind of turned around. So if you were a suffragette 100 years ago, you'd be proud to be called a suffragette, even though that term originally began as an insult. So think about the early period of these reclaiming processes as they applied to insults. In the early days, to make sense of the reclaimed term, right? Like to understand what it was, you had to know that it was an insult, okay? So that's like the old framework. But that didn't oblige you to accept the old framework because you could change the meaning of the word. So I had to know originally that suffragette was an insult, but it was still up to me and other people who embraced the word. We didn't have to accept the old meaning as a put down, and we could reclaim it, retool it as a badge of honor, as a proud thing to be, okay? So it's true that the original meaning was necessary to make the words intelligible, but the fact that their intelligibility depended on an old understanding, that was still consistent with changing the meaning of the words. And I'm arguing that something similar is true of not the word meat, but the concept. So it's true, traditionally, we have had this concept of meat that has involved essentially the idea of eating animals, but that no more requires us to continue to affirm that old understanding any more than the traditional meaning of these insults rules out the possibility of reclaiming them and changing their meaning. So intelligibility does not set the boundaries of what a concept can mean any more than it does a word. Okay, two quick things. I mentioned there was an issue around the growth serum. I think that's true. So the growth serum comes from, it's made up of so-called fetal bovine serum. And so that's a slaughterhouse product. And so some people have said, well, if you're going to say that this stuff doesn't involve any harms to animals, I won't go into the gruesome details of how this product is made, but it is kind of gruesome. So I agree there's issues around that, but it bears pointing out that a lot of these companies are already trying to work on replacements that don't involve this growth serum, and they're using alternatives that don't involve animals. So the company that made the Singapore chicken bites, those chicken bites were made with fetal bovine serum, but they've said that they've switched. So I think that issue is gonna kind of drop out, and I would welcome that change myself. Okay, last possible objection. okay, Dr. Lamy, you're defending eating the flesh of animals grown in a lab. Well, what about the flesh of human beings? Okay, so so I want to say, well, yeah, somebody could make the flesh of human beings, but it wouldn't, right? You would not actually be eating the flesh of a once living person. Okay, so I want to say that on my view, it's true. I can't give an across the board reason to rule out somebody making and eating the lab grown equivalent of human flesh. So I'm just going to bite that bullet. But I can say I think there could be cases in which it would be unethical. Okay, so like if I show up at my enemy's house, right, and I have like, hey, I got a lab grown version of your heart, and now I'm going to bite into it right in front of you, and I'm kind of doing it with certain intentions, then I think that would be ethically wrong. The meat there is kind of a proxy, and it highlights kind of a disrespectful attitude on my part. But there could be cases where the motivations are very different. So there have been some cultures that have practiced so-called compassionate cannibalism, where it was part of the grieving process. Even in North America, some mothers, after they give birth, they've eaten the placenta. That would be another example of, I think, of kind of a harmless form of eating human flesh. So I concede there could be cases where it's wrong, but I also concede there's cases where it could be okay. I don't think I've opened the door to actually eating human beings. So I'm traditionalist in that way. Okay. So so I've been arguing about this. I've been arguing with the animal ethicists who object to it, but I just think it's worth concluding that people who are interested in animals, most of us, I guess I should say, are accepting of this product. So here's a quote from a very influential animal ethicist, Peter Singer, giving his endorsement. And so if I'm right, then this ultimately is a trend not only to be tolerated, but perhaps the spread of cultured meat arguably is something to be celebrated. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much. Now we'll be open to questions, so you can send them for the Q&A feature. We actually already have a few, and the first one's going to be, in your talk, you mentioned that factory farming is one of the leading causes of zoonotic diseases, but it's currently being overseen by the government and the media. And why do you think this is? And I guess also why synthetic meat in this case?
I'm not sure about that, and anything I say about this will be a little bit speculative, and I just want to clarify that what I say about this, I think, is not really essential to my argument. But just in my capacity as a guy who reads the news, it seems like what goes on in agricultural processes has never been a popular topic of popular discussion. There's a reason that factory farms tend to be located, outside of heavily popular, like they're not downtown, they're off in the country. And there's even been an attempt recently to have so-called ag gag laws, which limit the ability of people to come in and film what goes on there. So it's just, I think, an uncomfortable topic in general. And additionally, I mean, sometimes students, when we talk about food ethics, will say, I feel, if I'm a meat eater, I feel implicated. My own view is, though, that you don't need, it's not really about trying to convince everyone to go to zero when it comes to meat consumption. If you have one person who goes from eating a lot of meat to nothing, but you have two people who eat the same amount and they both become halfway reducitarians, that seems significant. So that, that's to be welcomed. And that seems to get lost in some of the public discussion as well. It's like we're trying to shame people or stuff like that. So my speculative answer is that we're just a little bit squeamish, I guess, to begin with, about what goes on in slaughterhouses, and don't perhaps want to face up to problems that come with some of the most everyday familiar food products that we know of.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, I guess, do you think that cultured meat products will catch on, or will people be resistant to the change, especially in the definition?
Yeah, I don't know. You can probably tell. I hope they will catch on. I mean, that woman holding up the bill in Singapore, like that made it seem kind of glamorous and cool. So I think it's possible that they will sort of catch on. It's hard to think of plausible objections. So maybe, I mean, it's still early days, so maybe we'll find out there's some kind of terrible side effect of the production process. But right now, it seems like the production process is vastly superior to that involving animals. So I think a big question is, can people who are not vegetarians, will they be open to it? And there have been a few journalists. So there was a guy from Bloomberg who went to Singapore, and he was just your average meat-eating American. And the way he wrote about those chicken bites in Singapore, he made them sound pretty good. So if the trend around flexitarianism is any sign, there are people out there who are trying to change the way they eat for reasons like the ones I gave at the beginning of this talk. If I think there's a reasonable chance it'll catch on, at least among those people, and I think that by itself will be a significant development.
Thank you. Okay. Another question says, thank you so much for your talk. I found it really interesting. You speak about three aspects of meat being origin, substance, and function, but focus specifically on the biological function like nutrition, mouthfeel. Could you speak a bit on the cultural function in our society? There is something symbolic about eating specifically meat. How could cultured meat be incorporated into these customs in order to meet the function criterion?
That's a really interesting question. So I quite agree that yes, meat does have a lot of cultural associations. So the fact that they vary from culture to culture, okay? So in our culture, we would be horrified if we found somebody was eating a dog or a mouse. Maybe not horrified, we would be disgusted. We don't think of dogs and mice as food animals for different reasons, but there are cultures in the world. Like there's parts of Switzerland, for example, in the countryside where eating dog is like a traditional Christmas dish. And there are parts of, I think, South America where eating mice and I think guinea pigs is also part of the culture. So it's undeniably true that meat does have a cultural function. The fact that it varies from culture to culture, though, I like to think shows that that cultural function is not part of the very concept, as my cultural understanding of meat might vary from somebody in a different culture, okay? So how could culture meat be incorporated into those customs in order to meet the function criterion? Well, I guess like it sort of depends on what it was originally doing in the person's diet to begin with. So, if there is a culture where it's like really essential to their experience of meat that involves killing an animal, then I think it's going to be a tough sell to replace meat in that context with the cultured version. But for a lot of people, like meat is about at least partially about like I want to have the same kind of experience at the table that my parents or my grandparents did. And if it's really kind of about community and something that we share with other people, so I will now come together over a traditional dish of my culture with my family or my extended family, and we'll have kind of togetherness in some sense. I think cultured meat could very easily fit into those kinds of occasions, because you're not, as I say, you're not changing the experience insofar as it involves the communal experience at table. So I guess that's my initial crack at trying to answer that.
Thank you. Next question says, I'm a fan of Impossible Meat. However, I came across a blog that was critical of Impossible Meat because of a study in which they killed rats. Apparently, the FDA was requiring this. I could have mixed it up, but have you heard anything about this?
I don't know if I've read the exact study that the questioner is referring to, but I have heard things kind of like that. So one issue is that in the United States, if you want to release new products, you often are obliged by law to engage in a testing process before they're released. And often those kind of laws require, even if you, the creator of the product, don't want to involve animal testing, the laws will sometimes oblige you to do animal testing. So one possibility is some people might object to that because they think these issues are ultimately a test of our personal purity. Okay, this is not my view, but this is a view somebody might have. Oh, I can't eat the Impossible Burger because some small number of mice died somewhere along the way in the production process. So if personal purity is like, it's like I can't be contaminated by that, that might be a problem. But my own approach is to question whether personal purity is really the right framework in which to approach these issues. So it might, well, I'm very open to the possibility that some mice may have died unnecessarily along the way in the creation of that product. But then I ask myself, compared to what? If they're being sold now in grocery stores in the meat department, and they're often being bought by people who would otherwise buy regular meat. And so if they can contribute in that way to the overall reduction in the amount of harm that animals experience, then I'd be inclined to say that they ultimately are defensible, especially if studies like the one mentioned were a one-time thing rather than some kind of ongoing part of the process of production.
Great, thank you. Next question asks, if something, based on your definition of meat, would you consider insects meat? It seems plausible that they meet substance criteria, but would it apply for function or especially mouthfeel?
Yeah, if your original definition of meat included insects, then I would say that if somebody created a cultured version of insect meat, right, that was functionally identical to, you know, what it'd be like to bite into a beetle or whatever, had the same nutritional profile, all of that, I'm very open to that possibility. Okay, so and there are people who do eat insects. I guess it depends though, like, have we traditionally included insects? Are they, so I'm definitely open to the possibility that insects can be meat. I have no deep objection to that.
Okay, thank you. Another question asks, if something is not intended to be eaten, could it still be considered meat? And does that implicate the function part of your argument?
So if you think of human bodies, okay, I think it's not controversial to say that for most of us, at least, we don't often think of human bodies as something to be eaten. But as I said in my presentation, there could be cases where people do eat them. So I think intentions certainly matter when it comes to determining what any individual will want to eat. But I don't think my definition really is really essential to intentions. So there could be, like, if we imagine some species of animal that no culture eats, okay, could it still be meat? I think my answer is going to have to be yes. Okay, that's not saying we should eat it, but I think insofar as it's something that we can't, you know, we can digest it, we have that experience, and it has a certain kind of substance, then I think I just have to say yes, it can be meat.
Thank you. Another question, how have the ethical missteps of GMOs, like the lack of labeling, affected the acceptance of cultured meat?
So there's a debate about GMOs. There was a letter by some large number of scientists in one of the scientific journals, and they said that Greenpeace and other NGOs should be much more cautious in their option to GMOs because they have a positive side effect that can be much more land efficient, for example. So it's not clear to me that there's a package deal here where our feelings about cultured meat must rise and fall with our feelings about GMOs. However, the question mentions the labeling issue, right? So I think I can see how, excuse me, somebody who's already kind of concerned about issues around labeling, and maybe have Monsanto and some of the other companies that have made GMOs, so they've been fully transparent. And if you feel burned by that, maybe you also might feel slightly wary about eating cultured meat. But so that might be cases where that happens. I guess my own view, though, is like, it's not like, so there's lots of issues around the labeling of traditional meat right now, okay? So the idea that, you know, something is free ranged or organic, right? I mean, I don't want to necessarily endorse this view, but there's a view that says those labels on traditional meat products are already kind of meaningless, and they're ultimately more marketing terms than they are reliable guides to the processes themselves. And that's because it's just much more attractive, you know, from a commercial point of view. You're going to get more buyers for, you know, saying, oh, this is cage free or pasture raised or whatever, and leaving it very vague, right? So if you're already comfortable buying traditional meat products, even though there's like a lot of question marks around the reliability of traditional labeling there, I don't think you face a new issue when we come to the cultured stuff. And if we're open to all of the ambiguity on that side, then it seems like we should be, if anything, more open to the cultured stuff, because, you know, like, just some of those issues are no longer going to apply. Like, well, it doesn't matter if it's pasture raised because it didn't come from an animal, it comes from a lab.
Okay, thank you. Another question. In a lot of cultures, there are specific ways to eat animals. For example, in Slavic culture, specific parts of a goose go to guests, friends of the family, the chef, and more. Does cultured meat allow to replicate all parts of the animal, or only create patties?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think so I would say right now, they've already replicated chicken breasts and hamburgers, but they don't want to stop there. So I think the long-term goal is to replicate really any part of an animal. So, you know, 20 years ago, if somebody had said, we're going to be able to grow even a chicken breast or a hamburger in a lab, the possibility of even doing that would have been quite striking and shocking. And so it seems like that's like the crucial threshold. I think it's just gonna be a matter of time before these other components also get the lab grown treatment. As I mentioned, they're already working on eggs and dairy products.
Right, thank you. Another question is that if people start accepting, cultured meat as an acceptable version of meat, do you think that makes more likely or even necessitates a societal ban on factory farmed traditional meat in the future?
I personally would like to see factory farms outlawed. I think what they do to animals in those operations are criminal. So I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about places where there's a concern for the well-being of the animal that goes into the slaughter process. I don't want to say everything is hunky-dory there, but I want to say, like, if you look at things like ballot initiatives in the United States, here in California and elsewhere, there's been a lot of ballot initiatives that say they're going to regulate things like the amount of space that a chicken will get in one of these big operations, whether they're going to use gestation crates to isolate baby cows and stuff like that. There's increasingly a significant amount of popular public support just on the part of everyday people. Forget about vegetarians for the moment, who say, like, there should be some limits to what's done in the production of these products. This is not yet the mainstream view, right? And there's intense resistance on the part of big agriculture, but it does stand, right? So I personally, am I okay with that outcome? I would love that. Okay, now that's not the same as saying we should criminalize eating meat. I don't think we're having a serious discussion about that. I don't think those kind of laws, among other problems with them, I just don't think they'd be enforceable, right? But if we're talking about factory farming in particular, yes, I would welcome that. Do I think that the spread of cultured meat would in some way contribute towards that goal? it is hard to say, but one of the big reasons that the industry is currently so unregulated is that it's hard to get animal welfare measures through legislatures because the animal agriculture industry has a lot of lobbying power. That's one reason why these ballot initiatives tend to be more successful than attempts to pass laws through legislatures. So it stands to reason that if these kind of products catch on, then that would reduce the sheer economic power of the industry, which has traditionally been a major opponent of things like increased animal welfare regulations. So I don't think it would be a guarantee or anything like that, but it seems like it would address one of the causes, one of the reasons preventing us having those kinds of laws.
Great, thank you. Question as a follow-up to the goose question from before, if the technology does advance such that we're able to, I guess, replicate the specific body parts of animals, do you think that would make ethically permissible the synthetic production of controversial products like foie gras?
Sorry, did I catch the question correctly? So if these things catch on, would it permit the production of controversial meat products like foie gras? Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, so foie gras is an especially controversial meat product these days because the process involves fattening the goose. They put these pipes down the goose's throat and they just kind of fatten it, and it seems kind of especially hard on the animal. And so there are people who object. I've read that. People will say like, look, I'm a meat eater, but I'm not going to eat foie gras because it's especially cruel. So flash forward 50 years and we've got cultured meat all over the place. Would that possibly result in like cultured foie gras? And maybe if so, what should we say about that? Well, yeah, yes, I think it would result in that. But I think the reason for that, the cultured foie gras, the objections that have applied to traditional foie gras would no longer apply because there's no goose that is made to experience an especially high degree of suffering in the process. Rather, we have this kind of lab product. And so that kind of foie gras, it seems, would no longer be controversial, or certainly would not be controversial for the reasons that traditional foie gras is.
Great, thank you. Another question is, I think we touched on like the especially legal perspectives on cultured meat in the United States and partly France, but what are some of the other kind of, I guess, global perspectives around the world on this, especially maybe like in Singapore?
Global perspectives now on the culture of meat, like different cultural attitudes?
Or the perspective on cultured meat?
Oh, okay. So this is pretty new. So I don't know if many places have had a chance to develop a very well worked out view. If you think about Singapore, so some people ask like, why did it happen in Singapore? Okay. So the short answer is I don't know, but I'll share with you one explanation that I've heard. So one explanation I've heard is that, well, Singapore, if you know anything about Singapore, it's a small little city state. It's very urban. It doesn't have a big agricultural industry the way we do here. So you take that out of the equation, the objections to regulating it. So Singapore, I think, was one of the first jurisdictions to say, we can regulate this product and bring it to market. That concern goes away. I am unaware of any cultural community to date that has objected to cultured meat. If you think of, so as it happens, for example, Israel, there's been a lot of development of cultured meat in Israel. It seems to be a real hotspot, okay? So, and one reason for that is Israel has a fairly well-developed high-tech industry. But think about the kosher laws. How would they apply to cultured meat? And it seems that so far cultured meat has been regarded as kosher. And why is that? Well, it doesn't violate the prohibitions, the purity prohibitions that the kosher laws are based on, right? So similarly, if you think about like the halal prohibitions in the Islamic tradition, right? It doesn't seem to run afoul of those either. So it seems like a lot of the if we think about cultural attitudes to meat and take things like traditional religious dietary codes, those two examples would seem to be okay with it. If you think of India, where 30% of the population or thereabouts is vegetarian, so I'm unaware so far of anybody from like an Indian religious perspective saying we got a big problem with this. So now I don't want to rule out that possibility. Maybe that will happen, but so far it sort of hasn't happened yet. But I think that's just a sign. That's just a result of the fact that we're still in the very early days with this. So that raises an interesting question that kind of goes beyond what this question asks. But it seems like a lot of these questions, these are good questions about like the kind of the cultural significance. Okay. So that raises a question, right? Like, what weight should we give to the cultural significance of any food product? Okay. It's like, well, there's different possibilities here, right? But maybe someday there will be a culture that says, no, it's just part of our culture that we're going to kill animals. And that's really deeply ingrained in our culture. And so we're going to reject cultured meat in favor of the traditional version. Okay. So that's like a lot of weight to give to cultural considerations, right? So you'd be kind of saying like, that's more important than the climate change factors. That's more important than the other environmental impacts separate from climate change. That's more important than the harms done to animals and whatever harms are done to human beings, right? But it's not clear to me that cultural considerations should be that strong, okay? So imagine this alternate universe, okay? There's some alternate universe out there where there's some group of human beings who have traditionally been eaten by other human beings. And somebody comes along and invents an in vitro version, a cultured version. And people say, well, we attach a lot of cultural significance to eating human beings, okay? What weight will we give to that argument in that alternate universe? And I would say the mere fact that a practice is culturally entrenched does not add any does not give it ethical significance or force. And the reason for that is I can think of many practices historically that have been profoundly culturally entrenched, which I have no hesitation saying were deeply unethical, even though they were deeply culturally entrenched. So think about the role of slavery in the ancient world and how, Athens and Rome were basically built on slavery. That was part of their culture. It was still wrong. Think about foot binding. That was part of some cultures. It was still wrong. Think about views that said a man owned his wife. That was deeply culturally entrenched, and it was still wrong. So if somebody, and again, I'm not attributing this view to the question, right? But if somebody were to say, cultural entrenchment is the decisive consideration, I would just say, if that's the road we're going to go down, then we're just opening ourselves up to just some really, possibly much wider justification, right? So in the United States, in the 20th century, when the debate was raging about the civil rights movement, I mean, there were people in the South who said, this is just how we, it's part of our culture and we don't want outsiders criticizing our culture, right? And so I just think like the cultural arguments, I don't want to say like culture smulcher, right? But I want to say it's not obvious that they would have a kind of defeater power. And by saying that, I don't think I'm saying anything necessarily radical or anything that arises out of my views on cultured meat in particular. It just seems like we've been down this road 100 times before, and the possibility of something being unethical and culturally entrenched is a familiar combination. And by using these human examples, I certainly don't mean to suggest that, killing an animal for food is just as bad as killing a person. That's not where I'm going with. I'm just trying to point out that the cultural argument has been a big loser historically. And if that's what it ever came down to, it's just part of our culture, I think that argument would ultimately lose once again.
Great, thank you. Another question, could cultured meat lead to designer animals? For example, if cultured meat were developed in tandem with GMO technology, we might be able to see a duck with chicken breast or tenderloin, and would that be morally permissible, even if it changes what we consider to be natural animals?
That's a good question. So I talk a little bit of this in this book that I've written, Duty and the Beast. Okay, so I see how this question might arise. Like if we've reached the level of technological development, it's become so sophisticated that we can now actually grow the flesh meat in a lab, then it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to maybe other radical retoolings of animals, animal bodies, the parts of animal bodies. So yeah, that does seem possible. Okay. But I guess it seems like we're already doing that to some degree. And in my experience, a common justification for any practice that involves risks to animals. And a lot of these chimera, like these, like trying to like fuse one animal with another, the genetic modification of animals, I don't want to say this is the only justification, but this is one that you see with some frequency. Hey, look, we already eat animals. What's the big deal about genetically modifying them, right? As if to say, look, they already occupy this lowly moral status. Let's not get too concerned about genetically modifying them, given that we're all on board with, this much more harmful practice. It's much more widespread. But if, flash forward, say 200 years and cultured meat, and there's some alternate universe where it has completely replaced traditional meat, that alibi, that justification would no longer have force. People would say, well, actually, no, we don't actually eat them. We've replaced, we eat something that has certain features in common with them. But the idea, so it seems to me like it's not 100% clear that this would make this existing trend worse. Certainly, the more it catches on, the more it will address that very common justification. And one of the reasons that people like Peter Singer and others are in favor of cultured meat is precisely because they think it would do a better job of sorting out our ethical relationship with other species. So it's possible, I don't want to say it's guaranteed, but it's possible that their spread could be a sign of a more widespread recognition on the part of human beings that animals have a higher moral status than certainly our ancestors recognized. And if that's the reason that it spreads, then it could, this is speculation, of course, but it could actually put a damper on that kind of, open season on the genetic modification of animals attitude that this question draws to our attention.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about, the effects of synthetic meat cultured meat on especially ethics and impacting the environment and whatnot. But from a somewhat selfish perspective, how would cultured meat, change perhaps human health?
That's a good question. So insofar as it really does have the same substance as traditional meat, then it seems like the nutritional function would stay the same. So if I'm eating bacon morning, noon, and night from an animal, and now you give me cultured bacon, that probably wouldn't be a very good, an all bacon diet, that probably wouldn't be so great. So it would have the same negative health effects as my old bad diet. But if, every once in a while I'm eating a little bit of tuna or whatever, or the meats that tend to have a better reputation than bacon, it would have the same positive outcome. So that's on the assumption that it really is mimicking the traditional substance and function. Okay. If it doesn't do that, right? If it turns out tomorrow, we've thought it really is mimicking the traditional substance and function, but it's actually, you're introducing this new function, right? You take one bite and you die. That would obviously be pretty unhealthy. But A, I'm unaware of any cases so far where that's happened. And B, that would be a different product in my definition. That would no longer be cultured meat because it doesn't match the original substance and function.
Great. I think probably one of the last questions, if we use cultured meat as a full replacement for meat, how would that affect populations of certain animals possibly?
Yeah, so people sometimes worry about that. Like suppose tomorrow it just becomes like super popular, okay? Like the whole world says overnight, we're not going to eat cows and chickens anymore. We've got this cultured stuff, okay? So you might think, there'd be this problem. We'd have all these extra cows and chickens and, they're not going to go to market. So like, what do we do with them? So I'm kind of not too worried about that kind of outcome. I think what is more likely is a long-term decline in the number of animals that are bred to be eaten in the first place. So over the long haul, the number of cows and chickens and pigs brought into existence, I think that would go into decline. But it seems like we've been down this road before. So if you think of the role, just take one of many examples, the role that horses used to play in transportation. So I think the number of horses in New York City at the turn of the 20th century, so around the year 1900, there were like hundreds of thousands of horses, because that's how people got around, right? And then cars came along, and now you don't have stables on, every corner. And the number of we still have horses. We don't have as many horses as we did in the days of carriages and horse-driven transportation. So I think there would be a similar long-term decline, but just as horses still exist, I still think pigs and chickens and cows would still exist. It's just the ones that did exist would have, I like to think, better lives. And now we get into population ethics, and we could do a whole presentation on this. On my view, we do no moral wrong when we refrain from bringing an entity into existence, whether human or animal, that we otherwise could. So I think we have no obligation to maximize the population of our species or other ones. So that long-term decline, in my view, that would be perfectly fine, even in several ways possibly positive.
Thank you. Okay, probably for our last question, and maybe the most important one this entire time, is a hot dog a sandwich?
I've been looking at that question for a long time now. Is it a sandwich? I mean, yeah, I want to say it is. Yeah, it is. Like, for too long, we've had this extra element in our conception of our concept of a sandwich. We think the bread's got to be on top and the meat and then the bread. I'm saying, no, strip that out. If it has the traditional substance and function of it's a sandwich, man. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's probably it for the Q&A.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed this.